In the forgotten hills of eastern Kentucky, where morning mist still clings to valleys that time seems to have abandoned, there exists a documented case that has puzzled historians for nearly 2 centuries. In 1834, the Reverend Ezekiel Morrison and his 9-year-old twin daughters, Rebecca and Rachel, arrived at the remote Baptist congregation of Pine Hollow, a community so isolated that maps of the era barely acknowledged its existence. What happened during their 3-day stay was meticulously recorded in the personal journal of Pastor William Phillips, a document discovered in 1987, when the old church was finally demolished. The journal entries describe events so precise, so unnaturally accurate that modern psychologists have studied them extensively. Yet none can explain how 2 young children could possess knowledge that defied every rational explanation. The Morrison twins didn't just predict future events. They revealed secrets buried for decades, described people they'd never met, and spoke of tragedies that occurred years before their birth. But perhaps most unsettling of all, every single detail they revealed proved to be absolutely verifiably true. This channel isn't for everyone, only for those brave enough to confront mysteries that challenge our understanding of reality itself. Before we dive deeper into the Morrison case, make sure you're subscribed because we're about to uncover details that most historians refuse to discuss. And tell us in the comments what state you're listening from, because what happened in Kentucky might have happened closer to your home than you think. The story begins not with the supernatural, but with something far more unsettling: the possibility that some human minds can access information in ways science still cannot comprehend. The Kentucky of 1834 was a land caught between wilderness and civilization, where communities like Pine Hollow existed in virtual isolation among the Cumberland foothills. This particular settlement had been established in 1818 by 3 families seeking religious freedom away from the denominational conflicts plaguing larger towns. By the time the Morrison family arrived, Pine Hollow consisted of barely 200 souls, most related by blood or marriage, all bound by the strict Baptist doctrine that governed every aspect of their daily lives. The community centered around a modest wooden church, built with their own hands using timber from the surrounding hills. Pastor William Phillips, a learned man who had abandoned his comfortable life in Lexington to serve these frontier souls, maintained the only written records of births, deaths, marriages, and significant events. His meticulous nature would prove crucial in documenting what was about to unfold. Ezekiel Morrison was a familiar figure along the circuit of remote churches scattered throughout the Appalachian region. Tall and weathered with prematurely gray hair that spoke of hardships beyond his 34 years, he traveled on foot with his daughters, carrying only a worn leather satchel containing his Bible, a few personal items, and the journal where he recorded his spiritual observations. He had been widowed for 9 years, ever since his wife Sarah died giving birth to the twins during a terrible winter storm that had isolated their cabin for weeks. The girls, Rebecca and Rachel, were striking in their identical appearance, yet completely different in temperament. Rebecca, born first by mere minutes, possessed an outgoing nature that drew people to her immediately. Her smile was infectious, her laughter genuine, and she spoke with the confidence of someone far older. Rachel, quieter and more observant, seemed to exist in her sister's shadow. Yet those who looked closely noticed that she often began sentences that Rebecca would finish, or answered questions directed at her sister before Rebecca had a chance to respond. What made the Morrison family particularly noteworthy among the circuit preachers was Ezekiel's reputation for bringing spiritual renewal to struggling congregations. Stories followed them from church to church. Tales of backsliders returning to faith, of communities resolving long-standing conflicts, of spiritual awakenings that lasted for years after their departure. Some attributed this to Ezekiel's passionate preaching, but those who observed more carefully noticed that the real changes often began after private conversations with the twins. The journey to Pine Hollow had been particularly difficult. Late autumn rains had turned the mountain paths into treacherous mud, and Ezekiel had been forced to carry Rachel for the final 5 miles when she developed a fever. They arrived at sunset on November 15, 1834, just as Pastor Phillips was concluding evening prayers with a handful of congregants who attended weeknight services. Phillips later wrote that his first impression of the family was one of profound wariness, not just physical, but spiritual. Ezekiel's clothes were traveled and patched, his boots worn thin from countless miles of mountain paths. The girls clung close to their father. Rachel still pale from her fever, Rebecca's usual brightness dimmed by exhaustion. Yet something in their eyes, an alertness, an awareness that seemed inappropriate for children their age, made Phillips feel inexplicably uneasy. The congregation of Pine Hollow had extended hospitality to many traveling preachers over the years. But there was something different about the Morrisons from the very beginning. That first evening, as the family shared a simple meal with the Phillips family, Rebecca asked the pastor's wife about her garden, specifically inquiring whether the roses by the eastern fence had recovered from the blight that nearly killed them 3 summers ago. Mrs. Phillips had dropped her spoon, staring at the child in amazement. The rose blight had indeed occurred 3 years prior, devastating her prized flower garden. But it was not something she had mentioned to anyone outside the immediate community. When pressed, Rebecca simply smiled and said she had dreamed about roses while walking, and somehow knew that Mrs. Phillips grew the most beautiful ones in the county. This incident, recorded in Pastor Phillips's journal, that very evening would prove to be merely the first of many that would challenge everything the Pine Hollow community believed about the natural world. The next morning dawned gray and cold with a bitter wind that rattled the windows of the small cabin where the Morrison family had been given shelter. Pastor Phillips rose early, as was his custom, to prepare for the day's sermon. He found Ezekiel already awake, sitting by the dying embers of the fire, his Bible open, but his eyes staring into the distance with an expression of deep concern. The girls had disturbing dreams last night, Ezekiel explained when Phillips inquired about his troubled demeanor. They often dream of the places we're going to visit, but these dreams were different, darker. Before Phillips could respond, Rebecca appeared in the doorway, her hair disheveled from sleep, but her eyes alert and focused. "Pastor Phillips," she said in her clear, childish voice. "In your church, beneath the 3rd floorboard from the altar. There's something hidden that shouldn't be there. Rachel dreamed about it, and I dreamed about why it's hidden." The pastor felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. He had indeed hidden something beneath those exact floorboards, a bottle of whiskey that represented his ongoing struggle with temptation. Not a soul knew about it. He had placed it there during a moment of weakness 3 months prior, telling himself it was better to keep it close, where he could resist it daily, rather than to remove the temptation entirely. It was a secret that shamed him deeply, one he had confessed only to God in his private prayers. "What exactly did you dream, child?" Phillips asked, his voice barely steady. Rachel emerged from the shadows behind her sister, moving with that peculiar silent grace that seemed to characterize her every action. "The bottle is brown," she said softly, "and it's wrapped in a piece of cloth that used to be a baby's blanket. A blue blanket." Phillips sank into his chair as if his legs could no longer support him. The cloth was indeed a remnant of a baby blanket, the blanket that would have belonged to the son he and his wife had lost in infancy 5 years earlier. He had wrapped the bottle in it as a reminder of his failures, both as a father who couldn't save his child and as a pastor who couldn't conquer his own weaknesses. Ezekiel watched his host's reaction with an expression that mixed sympathy with a weary familiarity. "It started when they were very young," he explained quietly. "At first, I thought it was merely childish intuition, the way young ones sometimes sense things adults miss. But as they grew older, their insights became more specific, more impossible to explain through natural means." That Sunday service would be remembered by every member of the Pine Hollow congregation for the rest of their lives. Ezekiel's sermon was powerful, but not unusual for a circuit preacher, a passionate call for spiritual renewal and confession of sins. It was what happened afterward that defied all rational explanation. As the congregation began to file out, Rebecca approached Samuel Turner, a prosperous farmer known for his generosity to the church and his standing in the community. She looked up at him with her innocent blue eyes and said, "Mr. Turner, the money you've been taking from the church collection isn't really stealing if you put it back, is it? Papa says God forgives those who repent." The color drained from Turner's face. For 6 months, he had been skimming small amounts from the collection plate to cover debts from a failed investment in a Louisville business venture. He had told himself he would replace every penny once his financial situation improved, but the missing money had been eating at his conscience like a cancer. Before Turner could respond, Rachel moved to stand beside her sister and addressed Martha Whitfield, the elderly widow who served as the church's unofficial moral authority. "Mrs. Whitfield, your husband didn't die in the farming accident, did he? He's still alive somewhere, and that's why you hide the letters." The elderly woman swayed as if she might faint. Her husband had indeed abandoned her and their children 15 years earlier, taking their savings and disappearing one night without explanation. She had fabricated the story of his accidental death to preserve her dignity and her children's future in the community. The letters Rachel mentioned were the occasional correspondence she received from him, pleading for forgiveness and describing his new life in Missouri. She had never spoken of them to anyone. One by one, the twins moved through the congregation, speaking quietly to various members. To Dr. Hayes, they mentioned patients who had died under his care due to his lack of proper medical training. To the Miller family, they spoke knowingly of the son they kept hidden in their attic, a young man whose simple mind made them ashamed before their neighbors. To young Thomas Brett, they described in detail his secret meetings with Elizabeth Carter, the married woman whose husband traveled frequently on business. Each revelation was delivered with childlike innocence, without judgment or malice, as if the girls were simply sharing observations about the weather. Yet the accuracy of their statements was so precise, so impossible that the congregation stood frozen in a mixture of terror and awe. Pastor Phillips watched in horrified fascination as his orderly community was turned inside out by 2 9-year-old children who spoke of secrets that should have been known only to God. But it was Rebecca's final statement that would haunt him for the rest of his days. She walked to the front of the church, stood before the altar, and placed her small hand on the wooden cross that had been carved by the church's founding members. "This is sacred ground," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the silent sanctuary. "But it's been stained by what happened here before. The Whitman family didn't die in a house fire, did they, Pastor Phillips? They died right here in this very room, and some of you know exactly why." The silence that followed was deafening. Even the wind outside seemed to have stilled, as if nature itself was waiting for someone to respond to this impossible accusation. The revelation about the Whitman family struck the congregation like a physical blow. Pastor Phillips, his face pale as morning frost, gripped the pulpit so tightly his knuckles went white. The Whitman tragedy was Pine Hollow's deepest secret, a wound that had never properly healed despite 16 years of collective silence. In 1818, when Pine Hollow was still a struggling settlement of barely 50 souls, the Whitman family had been among its most prominent members. Jacob Whitman served as both blacksmith and unofficial leader, while his wife Mary was known for her skill with herbal remedies and her gentle way with difficult births. Their twin daughters, Hope and Faith, had been the community's darlings, bright, beautiful 9-year-old girls who sang in the church choir and helped their mother tend to the sick. The official story, the one recorded in Pastor Phillips's predecessors' carefully maintained records, stated that the Whitman family had perished in a tragic house fire during a winter storm. Their bodies had been found in their home's remains, and they were buried in the church cemetery with appropriate ceremony. The community mourned, rebuilt, and moved forward as frontier communities were forced to do when tragedy struck. But Rebecca's statement suggested a far different reality, one that several of the older congregation members had hoped would remain buried forever. Elder Thompson, now 73 and one of Pine Hollow's founding families, slowly rose from his pew. His arthritis made movement painful, but his voice carried the weight of decades when he finally spoke. "Child," he said, his words measured and careful, You speak of things that happened before you were born in places you've never been. How could you possibly know about what you claim to know? Rebecca turned to face him, her blue eyes holding an unsettling maturity. Faith Whitman had a birthmark on her left shoulder. She said quietly. Hope had one on her right ankle. Faith always carried a wooden doll that their father carved, and Hope wore a silver locket with their mother's hair inside. When they died, Faith was wearing her blue Sunday dress, and Hope was in her nightgown because she had been ill with fever. These details, impossible for a stranger to know, sent a murmur of recognition through the older members of the congregation. Elder Thompson's wife clutched his arm, her eyes wide with recognition and fear. The night they died, Rachel continued, her voice soft but clear, it wasn't a house fire that killed them. They came to the church seeking sanctuary because someone was hunting them. They hid behind the altar, but they were found anyway. The church had grown so quiet that the sound of breathing seemed unnaturally loud. Pastor Phillips found himself remembering fragments of conversations he had heard over the years. Whispered words that stopped when he entered a room, meaningful glances between the older members when certain topics arose. The way some families always left flowers at an unmarked spot in the cemetery. Samuel Turner, still shaken by the earlier revelation about his financial transgressions, stood up abruptly. "This is madness," he declared, though his voice lacked conviction. "These children are speaking nonsense, making up stories to frighten us." But even as he spoke, other details began emerging from the congregation. Mrs. Carter, Elizabeth's mother-in-law, whispered something about blood stains that had appeared on the church floor years later. Stains that couldn't be cleaned no matter how hard they scrubbed. Old Benjamin Foster mentioned the strange sounds that sometimes echoed from the church late at night. Sounds like children crying that had been dismissed as wind through the loose boards. Dr. Hayes, despite his earlier embarrassment about his medical qualifications, found himself speaking up with clinical precision. "I've always wondered about the church's foundation," he said slowly. "When I helped repair the eastern wall 3 years ago, we found what looked like, well, what could have been bone fragments mixed with the original mortar." The implications of his statement hung heavy in the air. If the Whitman family had indeed died in the church, if their bodies had been secretly interred within its very foundations, then every service, every prayer, every moment of worship had taken place over their unmarked graves. Ezekiel Morrison had been standing silently throughout these revelations, his weathered face showing deep concern, but no surprise. He had witnessed similar scenes in other communities, watched as his daughter's impossible knowledge unraveled carefully maintained lies and brought long, buried truths into the light. "Mr. Morrison," Pastor Phillips said, his voice strained, "how do your daughters know these things? What manner of gift allows them such insight?" Ezekiel was quiet for a long moment, studying the faces of the congregation before responding. "I've asked myself that question every day for years," he finally said. "Their mother, Sarah, claimed to have the second sight, the ability to sense things beyond normal perception. But what the girls experience goes far beyond anything Sarah ever demonstrated. They dream of places they've never seen, speak of people they've never met, and know details about events that occurred before their birth." He paused, looking at his daughters with a mixture of love and profound sadness. "At first, I believed it was a blessing, a divine gift that would help me minister to troubled souls. But over the years, I've begun to wonder if it's something else entirely. The knowledge they possess, it comes with a cost. They carry the weight of everyone's secrets, everyone's pain. They know things children should never have to know." As if summoned by their father's words, the twins moved to stand together at the front of the church. For the first time since their arrival, they looked truly like the children they were. Small, vulnerable, and overwhelmed by the adult world swirling around them. "We don't choose what we see," Rebecca said, her earlier confidence replaced by a wariness that seemed far too old for her young face. "The dreams come whether we want them or not. We see what was, what is, and sometimes what will be." Rachel nodded, her hand finding her sister's. "The Whitman sisters visit our dreams sometimes. They want people to know what really happened to them. They want someone to remember them properly. The church fell silent again. But this time it was the silence of people grappling with concepts that challenged their fundamental understanding of reality. Some faces showed skepticism, others fear, and still others adorned hope that perhaps death was not the final ending they had always believed it to be. Pastor Phillips found himself at a crossroads that would define the rest of his ministry. He could dismiss the twins' claims as childish fantasy or deliberate deception, preserving the community's carefully maintained stability. Or he could pursue the truth, no matter where it led, and risk destroying the foundations upon which Pine Hollow had been built. The decision would prove to have consequences that none of them could have anticipated. That evening, as shadows lengthened across Pine Hollow's narrow streets, Pastor Phillips found himself unable to concentrate on his usual evening prayers. The twins' revelations had shaken him to his core, not just because of their accuracy, but because they had forced him to confront questions he had been avoiding for years. He had arrived at Pine Hollow 5 years earlier, eager to serve God in the wilderness and to escape the theological controversies that plagued the more established churches in Kentucky's larger towns. His predecessor, Pastor Moriah Hayes, had left behind meticulous records of births, deaths, and significant events, but Phillips had always noticed gaps in the documentation from the settlement's earliest years. The winter of 1818, in particular, seemed oddly sparse in recorded details. There were entries about harsh weather, supply shortages, and the deaths of several elderly residents, but the Whitman family's tragedy was mentioned only briefly. Jacob Whitman, his wife Mary, and their twin daughters, Hope and Faith, perished in a house fire on the night of December 21st. Their earthly remains were committed to the ground with appropriate Christian ceremony. What had always struck Phillips as strange was the lack of detail about such a significant event. Pastor Hayes had been thorough in his documentation of even minor incidents. Yet the death of an entire family, particularly one as prominent as the Whitmans, had been recorded with unusual brevity. Determined to understand what the Morrison twins might have uncovered, Phillips began searching through the church's stored records with new eyes, hidden beneath years of accumulated documents. He discovered a small leather journal he had never seen before. The pages were water-stained and fragile, but the handwriting was clearly Pastor Hayes's own. What Phillips read by candlelight that night would change his understanding of Pine Hollow's history forever. The journal revealed that Pastor Hayes had been deeply troubled by the circumstances surrounding the Whitman family's death. According to his private notes, Jacob Whitman had discovered something disturbing about certain members of the community, something significant enough that he had demanded a public confession and reparation. The nature of the discovery wasn't clearly stated, but Hayes's entries suggested it involved financial impropriety and possibly worse. On the night of December 20, 1818, Jacob Whitman had apparently confronted several community leaders in a heated meeting that lasted until well after midnight. Hayes wrote of raised voices, accusations of theft and corruption, and threats of exposure that would destroy the reputations of some of Pine Hollow's most respected families. The final entry, dated December 22nd, was particularly chilling. The Lord forgive us all for what was done. Jacob and his family came to the church seeking sanctuary, but they were followed. I heard the children crying. Then silence. When morning came, we found them as they had been left. Elder Thompson and the others insisted we must protect the community's future, that the truth would destroy us all. I have agreed to their plan. May God have mercy on my soul. Phillips set down the journal with trembling hands. The implications were staggering. The Whitman family hadn't died in a house fire at all. They had been murdered in the church itself, and the community's leaders had conspired to cover up the crime. But how could the Morrison twins possibly know details that had been hidden for 16 years? How could they describe the children's clothing, their personal belongings, their physical characteristics with such precision? His contemplation was interrupted by a soft knock at his door. Opening it, he found Rebecca standing in the moonlight, still wearing her simple dress, but with her hair neatly braided as if she had been awake and preparing for something important. Pastor Phillips, she said in her clear, childish voice. You found Pastor Hayes's journal, didn't you? The one he hid behind the loose stone in the foundation. Phillips stared at her in amazement. He had indeed found the journal in exactly that location, guided by a subtle draft that had led him to discover the loose stone. How did you know where to tell me to look? He asked. Faith showed me in a dream. Rebecca replied matter-of-factly. She said, Pastor Hayes was a good man who was forced to do bad things. She wanted someone to know the truth. The casual way she spoke of receiving guidance from a long, dead child sent chills down Phillips's spine. Rebecca, he said carefully, what exactly do you see when you have these dreams? The child's expression grew serious, and for a moment, Phillips could see the burden she carried. We see everything, she said simply. Not just what happened, but why it happened. Rachel nodded, her small hand resting on Rebecca's shoulder as she spoke in her quiet voice. We see the fear in people's eyes. We hear their last words. We feel their pain. Pastor Phillips swallowed hard, the weight of their words pressing down on him. He had heard the truth from them in ways that were impossible to ignore, impossible to explain, and now it was clear that whatever divine gift, or curse, had been placed upon these children was both a burden and a blessing. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps from outside. It was clear that things were moving quickly now, and a sense of finality was descending over the community. Rebecca looked up at him again, her eyes wide with that unnerving knowingness. The others are coming, Papa, she said, turning to Ezekiel with a tone of quiet certainty. They want you to understand. What you saw today is just the beginning. Ezekiel Morrison stood up, looking over at Pastor Phillips with a deep, almost sorrowful gaze. What my daughters have shown you is just a fraction of the truth. They've been carrying this burden for years, seeing things others cannot, knowing things others have forgotten. It's not just the Whitmans or the murdered travelers. It's more. It's everything. And one day they will have to let it all go. Phillips's mind raced as the implications of Ezekiel's words settled in. The lies, the buried secrets, the very foundations of Pine Hollow had been built on bloodshed and deceit. And now, through the eyes of two young girls, the truth had emerged, unwillingly, yet inescapably. There was a knock on the door, followed by the sound of someone stepping inside. It was Sheriff Mackenzie. His face was grim, and his hands were clasped behind his back, as though he was carrying a weight far heavier than his usual lawman's duties. Pastor Phillips, the sheriff said, his voice tinged with both disbelief and fear. It's time. We've confirmed the excavation site and what the twins said. It's all there. The remains of Marcus Webb, the missing travelers, and the tragic truth of the Whitman family. There's no denying it now. Phillips nodded, feeling his heart sink. He had hoped, somewhere deep inside, that this could all be explained away. But there was no explanation for the undeniable proof that was being unearthed. These children had spoken of things that no one could have known. No one except those who had committed the crimes. What happens now? Phillips asked quietly, his voice heavy with the weight of it all. Mackenzie hesitated for a moment, his eyes flickering to the twins. We're going to bring in the authorities, but... He paused, as if gathering his thoughts. I don't think any of us are prepared for what this could mean. These aren't just crimes. This is something beyond our understanding. And the community? Well, they'll have to face what's been hidden here for all these years. Ezekiel stepped forward, his face calm but resolute. The truth is here now. Whether the world is ready to face it or not, it's been revealed. My daughters are the voices of the past, the echoes of those who cannot speak for themselves. But now, the living have to make the choice. Will they accept the truth, or continue to live with the lies? Rachel's voice, soft but firm, added to the stillness of the room. Truth isn't just for the ones who are alive. It's for everyone, even those who have died. They deserve to be remembered, and we will help them. Pastor Phillips felt a deep shiver run down his spine. He had known something was wrong in this community for years. He had sensed it in the silences, in the whispered conversations that stopped the moment he entered a room. But never, in his wildest imaginings, Had he expected the depth of the darkness Pine Hollow had been built upon? We can't change what's already happened, Philip said, his voice low, but we can choose what we do now. We can bring the truth to light, and we must. The room fell into a heavy silence as everyone absorbed the magnitude of the decision. The clock seemed to tick louder, each second pulling them deeper into the uncertain future. Do you believe in redemption, Pastor? Ezekiel asked, his voice steady yet tinged with sadness. Phillips didn't immediately respond. His mind swirled with thoughts of forgiveness, of justice, and of how one could possibly move forward from such profound revelations. I want to, he said after a moment. I have to believe there's a way to redeem this, to redeem us. But right now I'm not sure how. Ezekiel nodded. Sometimes, redemption is not about fixing what's broken, but about acknowledging the brokenness and moving forward with a new understanding. The Morrisons can't undo the past, but we will do what we can, one step at a time, to help this community find a way out of the darkness. Rebecca stepped forward once again, her eyes focused and sharp as ever. The voices are quieter now, she said softly. But they are still here, and they'll always be here until they are heard. Mackenzie shifted uncomfortably, looking to Phillips for direction. What do you want us to do now, Pastor? We need to decide how to handle all of this, how we move forward, and how we manage this information. This is bigger than any one of us. Phillips looked around the room, his gaze lingering on the faces of those gathered: Ezekiel, his daughters, Sheriff Mackenzie, and the community that would soon learn the painful truth. For the first time, he understood that the weight of this revelation was not something they could bear alone. We start with truth, Phillips said, his voice unwavering, and we let the truth lead us. Whatever happens next, we face it together. As the words left his mouth, Pastor Phillips felt the room shift. Something that had been broken for so long was starting to mend. There were still so many unanswered questions, so much darkness left to uncover. But the first step had been taken. The Morrison twins stood quietly by their father's side, two young children who had become the voices of the forgotten, the lost, and the murdered. They had revealed secrets buried for decades, and now, as the first light of dawn peeked through the cracks in the church walls, it was clear that Pine Hollow's dark legacy was finally coming to light. The truth was out, and no matter how terrifying, no matter how unexplainable, it had to be embraced. As Pastor Phillips, Ezekiel, and the others walked out of the church, the air felt different, heavy with the weight of history, yet lighter with the hope of redemption. The next steps were unclear, but one thing was certain: the Morrison family had shown them all that sometimes the dead can speak, and when they do, the living must listen. As the congregation filed out of the church, the weight of the past seemed to settle on the shoulders of everyone present. Pine Hollow had been forever changed. The walls, the earth, the air itself had absorbed secrets, and now, like a dam breaking, those secrets were flooding into the open, uncontrollable and overwhelming. Sheriff Mackenzie, who had once viewed the Morrison twins with a mixture of skepticism and curiosity, now stood in solemn silence. He had seen the evidence, heard the confessions, and witnessed the impossible knowledge of the children. There was no denying it anymore. Something far beyond ordinary understanding had transpired in this remote community. As the morning sun finally broke through the dense mist, the community members gathered outside the church. They were no longer the same people who had entered the church a few days earlier. They were fractured, uncertain, their worldview cracked wide open by the revelations of the past days. Elder Thompson, his face pale with remorse and fear, shuffled toward the group. His knees buckled beneath him as he reached the front steps of the church. "I never wanted this to happen," he said hoarsely, his voice barely a whisper. "We never wanted it to go this far. It was supposed to be survival. We told ourselves it was necessary. But now I know better." He glanced at Rebecca and Rachel, his eyes filled with guilt. "I never thought anyone would know. I never thought the dead would speak." Rebecca stepped forward, her blue eyes as unflinching as ever. "They want to be remembered. All of them. The Whitmans, the travelers, everyone. They can't rest until the truth is known." And you can't erase what's already been done, Elder Thompson. But you can choose to stop hiding it. You can choose to be part of the truth. Rachel's voice, as quiet as ever, followed her sister's. We see things others don't. We see what happened before we were born. But we can't see what happens next. That's up to you. There was a long pause as the weight of their words sunk in. Then, Sheriff Mackenzie broke the silence. This community has been built on lies, but the truth can still save it. We need to make sure the victims' families are compensated, and that the guilty face justice. We need to rebuild, but we can't pretend it didn't happen. We can't erase the past, but we can face it. A murmur of agreement rippled through the group, but not everyone was convinced. Some of the older members, the ones who had lived in Pine Hollow the longest, seemed to shrink back, unwilling to confront the full scope of the crimes they had been complicit in. They had lived in denial for so long that the truth felt like a foreign, unbearable weight. Pastor Phillips, who had been standing quietly to the side, stepped forward. His voice was steady, though the burden of everything he had learned weighed heavily on him. We've all been complicit in this darkness, whether we knew it or not. But it's not too late to change. We can't go back to what we were, but we can go forward, together, as a community that faces the truth. We can't undo what was done, but we can choose how we live from this moment onward. His words seemed to settle into the air like a prayer, and the congregation stood silently, as though waiting for something, some sign that they were ready to move forward, to embrace the difficult and painful task of redemption. Ezekiel Morrison, who had been watching the exchange with quiet resolve, placed a hand on his daughter's shoulders. What's been revealed here is not just for Pine Hollow. It's for everyone who's carried secrets they've buried too deep. The truth will always find a way to surface. It's up to us whether we let it break us or whether we let it heal us. The Morrison twins, still small but somehow older than their years, nodded in agreement. We can't fix everything, Rebecca said. But we can help the world see that some things need to be remembered. Some things need to be healed. As the community began to disperse, there was a collective sense that something had shifted. The secrets of Pine Hollow were no longer hidden, and though the path forward was uncertain and fraught with challenges, there was a shared understanding that they would face it together. Later that day, as the sun began to set over the hills of Kentucky, the Morrison family prepared to leave. The church, once the center of this community's life, now stood as a silent witness to the revelations that had shaken its foundation. Pastor Phillips watched them go, his thoughts heavy with the burden of what had been learned and what was yet to come. Are you ready to leave this place? Ezekiel asked quietly, his voice laced with a mixture of sadness and relief. Rebecca looked back at the church one last time, her expression thoughtful. The voices are quieter now, she said softly, but there will be other places, other voices. We still have work to do. Rachel, her hand still nestled in her sister's, nodded. We'll keep listening, and we'll keep telling the truth. With that, the Morrison family walked away from Pine Hollow, their journey continuing through the mountains and valleys of Appalachia. They carried with them the weight of the past, but also the promise of a future where truth would no longer be buried, where the dead would finally be remembered. The story of Pine Hollow did not end that day. The excavation of the church's floor revealed more bones, more evidence, and more secrets, all of which would be documented in the records of the Kentucky State Archives. Judge Harrison's final report would serve as a stark reminder of the community's dark history, but also of the possibility of redemption. As for the Morrison twins, their legacy would live on in the stories of those who had encountered them. They would be remembered not as children, but as conduits of truth, voices for the dead, and instruments of justice in a world that had too long ignored the sins of the past. Pine Hollow, now a ghost town, would never return to what it once was, but perhaps, in time, its memory would serve as a warning that some secrets are too dangerous to remain buried forever, and that, sometimes, it takes the voices of the innocent to uncover the truth. As the weeks passed, the echoes of what had happened in Pine Hollow reverberated far beyond its borders. The investigation continued, and the findings were shared with authorities and historians across the state. The truth, once buried under layers of denial and fear, began to spread. The murdered travelers, the Whitman family, and the twisted foundation of Pine Hollow became the subject of state hearings and scholarly research. Every shred of evidence, every confession, and every piece of the puzzle was documented and preserved. The excavation site behind the church became a place of pilgrimage for those seeking answers. Some came out of morbid curiosity, while others came to honor the victims whose lives had been taken so violently. The remains of the missing travelers were returned to their families, or, in cases where no living relatives could be found, to forgotten burial plots where they could finally rest in peace. The graves, once anonymous and unmarked, were now memorialized, small stone markers inscribed with their names and the tragic date of their deaths. The Whitman family's story was also rewritten. The narrative of a house fire that had destroyed them was replaced by the true, horrifying account of betrayal and murder in the very church that had once been their sanctuary. But it was the Morrison twins who continued to capture the attention of the public. Their role in uncovering the truth was both miraculous and terrifying. News of their ability to see beyond the physical world, to connect with the dead, spread throughout the country. Some hailed them as divine instruments of justice. Others whispered about the unnatural nature of their abilities. The twins, however, remained out of the public eye. Ezekiel, protective as ever, moved his family from town to town, continuing his ministry in the remote churches of Appalachia. The people they encountered in each new place heard the story of Pine Hollow, of two young girls who knew things no living person should, and of how they had brought justice to a community long steeped in darkness. Despite the many questions that surrounded them, Rebecca and Rachel were always the same. They did not see themselves as heroes. They were simply conduits, channels through which the voices of the dead could speak. They were burdened by knowledge, yet carried it with a quiet strength that no one, not even their father, could fully understand. In the years that followed, there were reports of other strange occurrences in places the twins visited. Sometimes, people would claim to have encountered them on the outskirts of towns, or in quiet rural communities where mysteries still lingered. They would speak to travelers of their lost loved ones, or of long, forgotten deeds, just as they had done in Pine Hollow. But with each new encounter, the twins grew more wary. They did not stop speaking, but the toll it took on them was undeniable. It was as if every truth they revealed drained a little more of their vitality, a little more of their innocence. Eventually, the whispers stopped. The encounters became less frequent. It was as though the world, or perhaps the spirits themselves, had decided that their work was done. The Morrison family settled into a quieter life, far from the eyes of the curious and the press. They moved to a small town near the Tennessee border, where Ezekiel continued his preaching, and the twins attended school like other children, though they were always a little distant, always a little apart from the world around them. And then, one day, they vanished. No one knew where they went, or if they had gone willingly. Some say they returned to the hills of Kentucky, to the forgotten places where the dead still called out for justice. Others believe they simply grew tired of the burden they carried and found a way to silence the voices that had haunted them for so long. But the truth, like the ghosts of Pine Hollow, would never be fully forgotten. Years later, long after the last of the original community members had passed, the story of the Morrison twins would continue to be passed down. Through oral histories, written accounts, and even in the fading pages of old journals in dusty archives. The mystery of their powers, their knowledge, and their impact on Pine Hollow would live on in the minds of those who knew the truth, and in the hearts of those who believed that the dead never truly rest until their stories are told. And in the stillness of the Appalachian Mountains, where secrets are buried deep, there remains a quiet understanding that the truth, no matter how difficult or painful, will always find a way to rise to the surface. Just as it did in Pine Hollow, with the voices of two young girls who could never forget what others tried to hide. As time passed, the story of Pine Hollow and the Morrison twins began to take on a life of its own. It became part of Appalachian folklore, whispered in quiet corners, and passed along by generations who had never known the twins personally, but felt the weight of their legacy. The community that had once been built on secrets was now known for its revelation, its redemption, and the haunting knowledge that some truths are so powerful they can transcend time itself. In the nearby town where the Morrison family had settled, the twins became a myth, a cautionary tale for those who dared to hide their sins, or for those who believed the past could be buried and forgotten. Parents would tell their children to be honest, to face their wrongs, lest the Morrison twins find out. For some, the mere thought of those innocent, yet knowing eyes was enough to keep them on the straight and narrow. Yet, the true legacy of the twins was more complex than the tales that surrounded them. For as much as they had given the world the truth about Pine Hollow, they had never fully come to terms with what they carried. The visions, the voices, the knowledge of things no one should know. It had aged them in ways that no one could truly understand. Even Ezekiel, their father, who had known their burden from the beginning, was left with questions that lingered in the silence of their absence. Years later, after Ezekiel had passed, the quiet town where the family had lived began to notice something odd. Every so often, on the anniversary of the day they had arrived in Pine Hollow, there would be strange occurrences. Travelers along the mountain trails would claim to see two young girls walking together in the mist, their hair blowing in the wind, as if beckoning the lost souls of the past to follow them. Others would hear the faint sound of children's voices, talking of things they should not know. But no one ever spoke about it openly. The town had learned, over time, that some things were better left untouched. The Morrison twins had come, had spoken, and had left a mark on the world, one that could never be erased. They had shown the power of truth, but they had also shown the price of carrying that truth. In the years that followed, a few daring souls, journalists, writers, historians, came to Pine Hollow in search of the twins. They sought out old records, combed through abandoned church documents, and interviewed the remaining community members who had lived through those harrowing days. Some were willing to speak, but most had long since given up on the idea of uncovering more. The truth had come out, and with it, they had learned the hard way that some things, some knowledge, was too powerful to contain. But no matter how many tried to uncover what had happened in those hills so long ago, the legacy of the Morrison twins remained elusive. As years turned to decades, Pine Hollow faded into memory. The church was eventually abandoned, the land grew over with wild grass, and the stories of the past became little more than a whisper in the wind. Yet the story of the Morrison twins remained, passed on by those who remembered. Their lives, their gift, their sacrifice, remained etched into the landscape of Appalachian history. Some believed that they had gone on to live normal lives, far from the world that had demanded so much of them. Others whispered that they had returned to the hills, where they had first uncovered the truth, seeking solace in the mountains that had seen the darkness of their family's past. But what remained constant, what endured through the years, was the reminder that the dead do not rest easily when their stories are buried. The Morrison twins had shown the world the power of truth, and the price that had to be paid for it. And in the quiet, forgotten corners of Appalachia, in the depths of those mist-covered hills, the truth still lingers. It waits to be heard, to be understood, and to be shared with those brave enough to face the dark past that so many wish would remain hidden. As the years drifted by, the legend of the Morrison twins grew into something more than just a local story. It became a symbol of justice, of the unyielding power of truth, and of the lingering consequences of sins left unaddressed. But even as the story spread, some remained skeptical, dismissing it as superstition or folklore. However, those who had lived through the revelations in Pine Hollow knew better. One chilly autumn evening, a curious journalist named Samuel Albright found himself standing at the edge of Pine Hollow. He had read the stories, heard the whispers, and had been drawn to the mystery of the Morrison twins since his early days as an aspiring writer. The more he dug into the case, the more the strange, unsettling details kept coming to light. Something about it gnawed at him, a pull he couldn't ignore, as if the very land itself still carried the weight of the twins' revelation. Samuel had spent weeks combing through old archives, meeting with the few remaining elderly residents who had witnessed the events of 1834, and piecing together a picture that felt both incomplete and unnervingly clear. But despite his persistence, the answers eluded him. No one could explain the twins' powers, their knowledge of things that had been hidden for years, and even less could they explain their disappearance. Standing on the edge of the overgrown graveyard, Samuel shivered, not from the cold, but from a sense that something was watching him. He could almost feel the weight of the Morrison twins' presence, as though their very spirits still lingered here. With each step deeper into the hollow, the air seemed to grow thicker, as though the earth itself was holding its breath. Then, at the far end of the graveyard, he saw it, a faded stone marker, nearly hidden beneath a tangle of ivy and moss. It was small and unassuming, but the name carved into it made his heart skip a beat: Faith and Hope Whitman. Samuel knelt, his fingers brushing over the time-worn letters. He had heard the story of the Whitman family, of their tragic deaths in this very church, but to see their names here, to realize just how far the ties of this community's secrets stretched. He felt the weight of it all. The Morrison twins had not only revealed the sins of the past, they had forced the community to reckon with its darkest moments. As he stood to leave, Samuel heard the soft rustle of the leaves behind him. He turned, but saw nothing. The sensation of being watched only grew stronger, and the hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. In that moment, he understood. There were stories here that hadn't been fully told, and there were voices, too, that hadn't stopped speaking. The next morning, Samuel returned to the town, his mind racing with thoughts of what he had felt in the hollow. His encounters with the townsfolk had left him with more questions than answers. One elderly woman, Agnes Dillard, had pulled him aside after a conversation, her voice trembling. "You're not the first to come looking," she had warned him, her old eyes clouded with fear. "People like you come from time to time, hoping to make sense of the twins, of what they did. But you don't understand. Some truths are meant to stay hidden. Pine Hollow's past is a story that should never be told. Those who try to uncover it, they're never the same." Her words haunted Samuel as he stood before the local sheriff's office, debating whether to press for access to the town's oldest records. He knew there were still people, old-timers, who remembered the true events of 1834, but they spoke little. Some refused to acknowledge the truth at all. Others simply seemed afraid. The last thing they wanted was for anyone to disturb the dust of those long, buried secrets. But Samuel couldn't walk away. He had made a promise to himself that he would uncover the truth of the Morrison twins, no matter where it led. They had revealed things no one could explain, shown a depth of insight that defied reason. Whatever had happened in Pine Hollow had left its mark not just on the town, but on the land itself. There was unfinished business, something unresolved that even after all these years, still beckoned from the shadows. As days passed into weeks, Samuel found himself more deeply entwined in the mystery. He visited the abandoned church again, hoping to find something that would give him more clarity. It was a crumbling structure now, its once pristine wooden beams warped and rotting, and the altar long since removed. Yet there was an eerie stillness about it, as if the church was holding its breath, waiting for something. Then, in the dust and decay of the altar's former spot, he found it, an old leather-bound journal. His heart raced as he picked it up, flipping through the brittle pages. The handwriting inside was unmistakable. Pastor Phillips's, the man who had documented so much of what had happened in those fateful days. The journal detailed moments of doubt, of fear, of the overwhelming strangeness of the Morrison twins' abilities. Phillips had written about his growing unease, about how the twins seemed to know things that only the most intimate members of the community could understand. It seemed they had been channeling not just the dead, but the collective guilt of an entire town. But there was one entry, written on a dark, stormy night, that caught Samuel's attention. "The girls say it's not over," Phillips had written. "They say they can still hear them, The voices of the dead, the voices of the ones we've failed. But there's something else they said, something that chills me to my very core. They said that Pine Hollow will never be free. The dead will never rest here. And when the time comes, when the truth has been fully spoken, we will all face the consequences of what we've done. Not just the ones who've committed the crimes, but the ones who stood by and let it happen. Samuel's mind raced. Could it be that the Morrison twins had known something even deeper? Had they predicted the continued consequences of the town's sins? He read the final entry aloud, his voice trembling with the enormity of what Phillips had written. They say the truth will come again. But it won't be through them. It will be through someone else. And when it happens, we won't be able to deny it anymore. The words sent a chill through him as the weight of their meaning sank in. The Morrison twins had spoken the truth, yes. But there was more. An unfinished reckoning, a cycle that would one day come full circle. With trembling hands, Samuel closed the journal. He knew his search was far from over. Pine Hollow still held its secrets, and the Morrison twins, though gone, had left behind a legacy that no one, least of all Samuel, could ignore. As he left the church that day, the wind picked up, and for just a moment, he thought he heard the faintest whispers on the breeze, as if the voices of the dead were still waiting, still calling out for justice. As the weeks continued to pass, Samuel became more immersed in his pursuit of the Morrison twins' story. His obsession grew, fueled by the eerie sense that he was being drawn deeper into a mystery that had yet to fully reveal its darkest truths. The journal had given him a glimpse into the past, but it also left him with far more questions than answers. He spent long hours combing through town records, visiting the remaining elderly residents of Pine Hollow, and speaking with anyone who might have known something about the Morrisons, about the twins, about their extraordinary abilities, and about the strange occurrences that had plagued the town ever since they left. Despite his best efforts, though, most of the answers he sought remained elusive. Many of the town's oldest residents, who had lived through the time of the Morrison twins, were either dead or unwilling to speak about it. And those who did talk spoke in riddles, as if they feared what would happen if they said too much. One evening, while seated in a dimly lit cafe, Samuel overheard an elderly woman talking to a group of locals at a nearby table. She was speaking in hushed tones, recounting an incident that Samuel had never heard before. His ears perked up as he heard the words, Morrison twins, mentioned. Well, you know, the woman said, leaning in closer to the others, it wasn't just what they saw or what they told us. It was the way they made people feel. As Samuel's curiosity spiked, he leaned in slightly, careful not to draw attention to himself, but close enough to catch the full conversation. They had a way of seeing into your heart, the woman continued. It wasn't just the past or the future. It was the deep, hidden parts of a person, the things they didn't want anyone to know. There were people in Pine Hollow who never thought anyone would ever find out their secrets. But those girls, Rebecca and Rachel, they knew them all. Another person at the table, someone Samuel had not seen before, interrupted. I heard they were cursed, you know. That's what people say. That's why they could see things they shouldn't have been able to. The curse of the land. It has a way of coming out in people, don't it? The elderly woman nodded slowly. I don't know about curses, she replied softly. But I do know one thing. Once those twins left, the land changed. The air was heavier, the nights longer, and the fog never seemed to lift. It was as though Pine Hollow had been marked by something. Something it couldn't escape. Samuel's heart pounded in his chest. He had heard of the curse of the land before, but it had always seemed like a mere superstition. An old tale people told when they couldn't explain the unexplainable. But now, hearing it from someone who had lived through it, it struck him with new gravity. He needed to know more, and he knew he couldn't rely on the town's memory alone. He had to dig deeper. So that very night, Samuel made his decision. He would return to Pine Hollow once again, this time with a more determined purpose. The journal had led him this far, but there was more to uncover. The land, the church, the truth. It all felt like pieces of a puzzle that had been intentionally scattered, waiting for someone brave enough to put them back together. The next morning, Samuel drove out to Pine Hollow, his mind filled with questions. As he neared the outskirts of the town, a strange sensation washed over him. It was as if the landscape itself seemed to change, shifting in ways that felt unnatural. The trees looked more twisted, the air thicker, heavier with a sense of anticipation. And when he reached the edge of the old graveyard, it felt as though something in the very ground beneath his feet was watching him. As he stepped out of the car, he noticed something he hadn't seen before. A new gravestone near the back of the cemetery, partially hidden by overgrown weeds. It was small, humble, and clearly new, not like the older markers that had weathered over time. He made his way over to it, the hair on the back of his neck rising as he got closer. The dates were incomplete, as if someone had tried to mark their passing, but hadn't been able to finish it. A chilling thought crossed Samuel's mind. Could they still be alive? Had they really disappeared? Or was there something else, something darker, at play? With trembling hands, Samuel knelt beside the stone, studying the inscriptions. Something inside him clicked. This was more than just an unmarked grave. This was a clue, an unresolved mystery waiting to be understood. It felt as though the gravestone had been placed there for a reason, as if to tell him that the story wasn't over yet. A soft breeze stirred the leaves around him, and for a brief moment, Samuel thought he heard something. A whisper, barely audible, but unmistakable. He stood up quickly, his heart racing. The air seemed to shift, the quiet of the graveyard thickening into something oppressive, as though it was holding its breath. Then he saw it, a shadow moving in the corner of his eye. He turned, but there was nothing there. Just the old church, standing silent and decaying in the distance. The same church where so much had happened, where so many secrets had been buried. Samuel's instincts told him to leave, but he couldn't. Not yet. He needed answers. With renewed determination, he walked toward the church, feeling an inexplicable pull in his chest, a sense that whatever had been left behind here was waiting for him. Inside, the church was as desolate as ever. Dusty pews, broken stained glass, and a crumbling altar that seemed to belong to another time. But it was the air inside that felt different. It wasn't just the smell of decay. It was alive with something else. Something ancient. He moved toward the altar, carefully stepping over broken boards and debris. He had no idea what he was looking for, but something told him it was here, hidden beneath the layers of dust and neglect. Then, just as he was about to give up and turn back, his foot hit something hard. Kneeling down, Samuel cleared away the debris and found a small metal box, rusted but intact. His heart thudded in his chest as he carefully opened it. Inside, wrapped in faded cloth, was an old photograph. The image was worn, but Samuel could make out two young girls standing in front of the church. It was them, Rebecca and Rachel Morrison. But there was something else. Behind them, barely visible in the shadows, was a figure, a tall man with a familiar face. The revelation hit Samuel like a jolt of electricity. The man who had chronicled the events of 1834. The man who had once kept the secrets of Pine Hollow. Had he been more involved than anyone realized? The final piece of the puzzle had just fallen into place, and with it came the terrifying realization that there was still more to uncover. More than he had ever imagined. The story of the Morrison twins, the curse of Pine Hollow, and the fate of its people was not just a chapter of history. It was an unfinished book, and Samuel had just opened the first page. As the days passed, Samuel's obsession with the truth grew deeper, the mystery of Pine Hollow pulling him further into its tangled web. The photograph he found in the box haunted him. Rebecca and Rachel Morrison standing with Pastor Phillips, their innocent faces captured forever in a moment that now seemed more sinister than he had imagined. That photograph, with the shadowy figure of the pastor behind them, was the final clue that Samuel had been waiting for. The mystery of the Morrison twins was more complex than anyone had ever realized. The more Samuel thought about it, the more certain he became Pastor Phillips had known more than he let on. He had recorded everything, from the twins' unsettling abilities to their inexplicable knowledge. But had he hidden something? The presence of the photograph, with Phillips lurking in the background, hinted at something darker, a connection between him and the strange events that had unfolded in Pine Hollow. Determined to confront this final piece of the puzzle, Samuel decided to return to the town's archives, hoping to find anything that might tie Pastor Phillips directly to the deeper, darker side of Pine Hollow's history. As he went through the old papers, one particular document caught his attention. An old letter, barely legible, hidden in a faded folder. The letter was dated just before the Morrison family had arrived in Pine Hollow. It was written by Pastor Phillips to a distant relative in Lexington. It read, "The twins are a gift, a burden, and a curse. Their eyes see into places no human should. I thought I could protect them, guide them in their purpose. But they are more powerful than I ever realized. There are things I cannot explain, things they know, things we buried long ago. And I fear they are bringing it all back to us. I don't know how much longer I can keep this secret. But they are still just children, and I must protect them. Va, even if it costs me everything." The weight of the letter hit Samuel like a hammer. Pastor Phillips had known about the power of the twins, and perhaps he had known more about the darker past of Pine Hollow than he had ever let on. This wasn't just a matter of spiritual renewal or redemption. Phillips had been trying to control the twins' abilities, hide the consequences of the sins committed by the founders of Pine Hollow, and his involvement in those sins might have been more than just passive. Suddenly, the air in the room felt thick with realization. The community, the town, and the church, they had all been built on lies, on murder, on a hidden truth that refused to die. The twins, Rebecca and Rachel, had always known that, and their purpose had been to expose it all. Phillips had tried to bury that truth, but the twins had broken through. Their gift had forced everyone to confront the past, and in doing so, they had unleashed the very thing Phillips had worked so hard to hide. Samuel knew he had to return to Pine Hollow, to the church, one last time. The truth was finally within his reach, and if he was to complete the story, he would have to understand the full weight of what the Morrison twins had uncovered, and why they had vanished. The land, the ghosts, the hidden histories. It all led back to this place. As he stood outside the church, the air grew thick with fog, just as it had on the first night he arrived. The old wooden doors creaked as he pushed them open, and the silence inside seemed suffocating, as if the building itself was holding its breath. He walked down the aisles, the smell of decay and mildew surrounding him, until he reached the altar. There, buried under the debris, he found something new, a journal, the last of Phillips's writings. This journal, unlike the others, was different. It wasn't just a record of the past, it was a confession. Phillips had written it in his final days, when the weight of his guilt had become unbearable. Samuel slowly read the pages. "The sins of Pine Hollow are not just mine. They are ours. We built this place on blood, on the stolen lives of those who passed through here, who trusted us. I never meant for it to happen, but once we started, there was no turning back. The Whitman family was not an accident. They were sacrificed to protect our secret. But it wasn't just them. Others, too. The travelers, they were never just lost. We lured them here like lambs to the slaughter." The journal went on, revealing the full extent of the crimes committed by the original families of Samuel's heart pounded. It was all here. The truth had been revealed, and now it was time to tell the world. He stood for a long time in the silence of the church, staring at the journal in his hands, realizing that the weight of this knowledge would be his to carry. But there was something else, something he couldn't ignore. The ground beneath the church, the land on which it stood, was tainted. Tainted by blood, by lies, and by sins that could never truly be forgiven. It was a place where the past and the present collided, where the dead had waited for justice to be done. As Samuel left the church, he felt a strange sense of finality. Pine Hollow was no longer a place of secrets. The Morrison twins had left their mark, and now the truth would be known. He had uncovered their story, but he knew the work wasn't over. The history of Pine Hollow had been laid bare, but its consequences were far-reaching. In the end, Pine Hollow would never be the same. The truth had come to light, and with it, The reckoning had begun. The ghosts of the past had spoken, and now the living would have to listen. Samuel returned to the town with his findings, and the story of the Morrison twins, of their gift and the truth they had uncovered, became one of the most important historical accounts in the region. Pine Hollow was dismantled, its remnants scattered, and the land was left to be reclaimed by nature, the church torn down, its foundation washed clean of the sins of the past. But the legend of the Morrison twins, Rebecca and Rachel, lived on, echoing in the hills of Appalachia, a haunting reminder that the dead never truly rest until their stories are told. And the truth, no matter how long it takes, always finds its way to the surface.